so many things, don't you? You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Just change the pictures. Oh, the glasses. Oh, you've got another box.
Well, the conversation that took is, I said to her, the best would be with the organisation. She said it's a very good team. And I said, well, the team here at the organisation, she's really because Rachel has given to me, she's written no, and I said, she did this initiative for me, she's on commission, so it just makes sense. But I think she's around about these things. And she looked very helpless. She did. And she also looked like someone who's yeah. She was giving the street. Comment about I should put up go to the position and have this totally get the lives. I thought, so let's say it. Yeah. But she was rural because I said to her, she said, oh, 7 Ks, 9 for them or something. I guess the stores will try and get Did you hear that?
I did, but you know, you'd be disappointed.
I've been to too many movies for them, and I
can't understand how, I wish I could do that. It's like the people who just go immediately to sleep on the bus and that sort of thing.
It's all just napping though, it's not, you know, it just must be portions of sleep rather than...
Well, I suppose for some people, you know, the movies, it's dark and it's warm.
That's right. It's the heavy breathing that sometimes goes with it though, you know, you feel like...
I'm absolutely addicted to movies, so, you know, I don't go to sleep.
You've got a great little theatre here, haven't you?
There is a good theatre, yeah. We live in Hamilton, we've got one in Hamilton and also a small theatre in Cambridge, which is that's lovely. Yeah.
and they seem to be doing okay. You know, sometimes they got a good selection of art house films, festival films, and they serve a glass of wine.
And Palmerston North has got Centrepoint, and it's the only provincial theatre that's, you know, a professional in New Zealand, which is amazing. You know, I don't know how we keep putting on regular.
They've been lucky with the Roger Hall plays, and
it's become more popular because they used to do really complicated, quite challenging plays.
Right.
But they've definitely shifted, you know.
Yeah, well, that's a brilliant. No.
No.
It's the ones that are challenging.
Yeah. Did you see Doubt when they put Doubt on? I loved that. That was really good. Yeah.
Did you say they're professional theatre or are they?
It is a professional theatre.
So is Cork Theatre still going?
And that's in Christchurch.
Christchurch, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the guy
It was the Fortune
the
of
guy
the
from
Dunedin.
Centrepoint is actually from the dark room, who's just spontaneous. He's gone down to
Oh, yes.
So it just was a new...
He's a nice guy. Yeah. What's his name? Dan, is it? Yeah, so there's a new woman.
Yeah, she's all right.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Very different.
I grew up in a theatre family and we went from one act play festivals to one act play festivals. But boy, it was strong in those days.
It was, wasn't it?
Small town, Torrens, Lookouta, Pyro, Wayne, they all had
About 2 minutes away.
But people had more time,
Yes,
more money,
yes.
and things were more available. Now people are working 7 days a week just
Yeah,
to,
that's true.
you know, people don't have weekends anymore.
Big commitment.
Yeah, massive commitment. But you think about, I mean, when I lived in Gisborne, the amateur threat, they put on a show every 2 years.
Yeah.
And it was well supported, and people all throughout the community, the wardrobe ladies, the makeup ladies,
Yes.
you know, and they, I think the year I did Fun Girl, our director went to the New York acting, you know, I mean,
Yes,
it was
yeah,
a whole
Mind
lot of
you,
stuff.
Portsmouth have just put on Sister Act,
Oh,
and it's better than things I've seen in New York and in London.
Wow.
They did such a great show. In fact, I had nagged one of my friends to go with me, and she thanked me. She just couldn't believe how good it was. You
It's
know,
huge compliment.
I know it was truly amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're old enough, I think Denise is old enough, and I am, the New Zealand players. that
Oh,
used to-
absolutely. They come to the
yes,
schools.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I was really into this sort of thing when I was at school, and I said to the careers advisor, I was going to be an actor, and the careers advisor said, that's not a job. And I said, well, then I'd like to be a lawyer. And she said, a girl can't be a lawyer.
Teaching box.
I know. So I wasn't going to have a third try.
Only until you got married and had a baby, and then you lose your job and stay at home. Pop some Valium, drink some sherry.
Let's remind ourselves there have been some big changes on the days
Oh,
we think
huge
nothing has
changes.
changed. You have to
There have
think
been
about
huge changes.
But not always for the better, though. Interestingly, I think.
Do you think?
Yep.
What do you think isn't better?
That these poor women are made to work endlessly and raise children on their own and have no support and still
Oh, I
be
do
judged.
think that's a terrible
women are
situation.
You know.
supposed to do it all now.
That's exactly right, sister. Yeah, everything. The superpower, and then the dichotomy of the good girl, bad girl. There's nothing in the middle. You're either one or the other, and the status is never standard. You can switch instantly by one bad bit of clothing or one decision. Next minute you're shoveled into that section of things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of judgment still, isn't
Yes.
there?
Right, sorry, we have to keep going.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'd like to welcome Venetia and Denise to this session, and also welcome all of you here. I think you've all been here to other sessions though, so I don't think I need to go through the health and safety
No, we've
things.
absorbed it all.
Yeah, so we'll just
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. Thank you very much. And kia ora, greetings to you all, and thank you very much for inviting us to Fielding. Venetia and I and Venetia's husband John are having a very fine time here, and we could just sit here and talk to you in conversation. It's very pleasant, and so congratulations, well-run festival. Got off to a great start last night with the
Yes.
improv, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
It was fun, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So very, very pleasant. And so I'm Denise Irvine, and this is my friend and colleague Venetia Sherson. We're going to talk about our year of writing, Stand By Me, which is the book that we've had up on screen. The story of Te Whakareroho, Waikato Women's Refuge, and we're going to talk about our lasting impressions from that time. So, a quick overview of how the session will run. I'm going to introduce the book and the refuge, and then Venetia and I will each talk about some of the women we met during that time of researching and interviewing the book. And we're also going to cover, Venetia's going to cover some of the well-worn myths about domestic violence, because that is in essence what our book is about. And this is the book, and you've seen it on the screen, which it'll come back up again, I'm sure. And towards the end of the session, we're going to touch on the book that we are currently working on, which is about the People's Project in Hamilton. And thank you. Yeah, so we'll touch on the book we're working on at the moment, which is about the People's Project in Hamilton. It's an organisation that's dedicated to housing the homeless in the city. and we'll leave ample time for questions. I think we're due to finish at 5 o'clock. So, to start, Venetia and I are both journalists. We met in the late 1960s when we were cadet reporters at the Waikato Times newspaper in Hamilton, and we have been close friends and storytellers ever since. Fast forward several decades, we spent most of 2017 researching and writing about domestic violence. We were commissioned by Te Whakaruruhau Waikato Women's Refuge to record its 30 years of operation in Hamilton. And in consultation with the team there, we opted not to write a linear history, but to tell the story through interviews with the stellar women who work at the refuge and the courageous women who seek assistance there. We came to this project as two Pākehā women writing about a precious Waikato taonga, because that is what Te Whakaruruhau is. And we were, during this time, incredibly mindful of the trust that was being placed in us as we heard intimate and poignant and often shocking and raw stories. And as journalists in our craft, we are trained to always find the best story angle and to tell it in the detail that's been described to us. With this work, we were acutely aware of the personal implications for many of the women whose stories we were telling. Going public for them was huge, of course, on domestic violence. We listened carefully, we wrote judiciously, we consulted widely, and we brought a huge duty, we'd like to think we brought a huge duty of care to the work. And we edited our work in minute detail as some of the women had second thoughts about what they told us. They read and reread the chapters that we'd written. And we were always aware, so aware that this was their story and not ours. The book was launched in 2018 and it celebrates the work of Te Whakaruruhau founders Ronnie Albert and Ariana Simpson. And those are the two gorgeous women who started the refuge. That's Ronnie on my left and Ariana on the right. And so, yeah, our book celebrates their work and everyone who works with them on their journey to keep women and children safe. It's the story of the laughter, tears, anger, kindness and love that lies behind an organisation that has always sought to break new ground in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Te Whakaruruhau, briefly overview here, began in 1986 in a one-bedroom flat in Hamilton, which was the home of Ronnie and Ariana at that time, and it's expanded to become one of the biggest refuges in the country, a multi-million-dollar organisation, highly regarded in its sector, and its representatives are at the table whenever key government decisions on family violence are made. And that's the enclave now of safe houses. There's about 6 safe houses in an enclave in Hamilton, and the kids' playground and all those houses you can see are part of the refuge. They're funded through a mix of government contracts and local fundraising initiatives.
So that represents a lot of money.
It does, yeah, and huge fundraising in the Waikato.
Absolutely.
They have a lot of benefactors and still do, but there are government contracts as well, which gives them some very stable money each year. So they run the safe houses and they run a remarkable wraparound service as well. A lot of the work is in the community. That's Nani Nai, Nari Kelly, who is well into her 70s. She manages the Safe House Enclave. She's actually from Tokoroa, and she comes up to Hamilton, works in Hamilton 4 or 5 days a week, and we got to know her really well. She has been with the refuge for about 27 years, almost since its inception. She's an amazing woman. Her husband died while we were working on the book. She was absolutely unexpectedly, and he was a Pākehā man, and he had supported her right through her work with the refuge. You know, she went to Hamilton, every week, and he was rock solid, and I think his name was Rocky actually, and she was shattered by his death, but she has come back to the refuge, and she is still there. At the refuge, they see between they have stay with them between 200 and 300 women and children each year, and the refuge overall helps about 4,000 women annually through its residential, and I know, I can see the look on your face, in community services, and they deal with practical personal issues. They collaborate with many other agencies, and that's the team that works at the Safe House. You see Nanny Nye on the far left, and Ariana, and then a whole lot of other wonderful women who are kaimahi, the advocates who work one-on-one with the women when they come into the Safe House, and some of them also are house mums, who they have 2 house mums who are on duty 24/7, and they are incredible women as well. The woman on the bottom left with the white hair, she's a wonderful woman, and she actually delivered a baby one night when she was there on duty, which was not in her script at all. It was a woman who was very, very pregnant, and she called out one night, I think my baby's on its way, so they rang an ambulance, but in the meantime the baby came quicker than the ambulance, so that story got told, of course, many, many times. We found that the uniqueness of Te Whakaruho lies in these women, in its staff's ability to adapt to each family and to work day and night if needed, and as deliver a baby. They have seen 150,000 women and children since they've started, and this again seems a huge number, but it's not surprising in a country, sadly, with one of the highest reported rates of family violence and sexual violence in the developed world. And we're not going to dwell on statistics here, but we think it's worth saying that 13 New Zealand women are killed by their partners each year, and in 2017 there were 120, when we were working on the book, 120,000 police call-outs for family violence, and that's 1 every 4 minutes, and those are just the ones that are reported. So in that year, Venetia and I met abused women from all walks of life who felt shame, judgment, guilt, worthlessness, and were sometimes paralysed by fear. One young woman I met at the refuge had been locked in her garage for a week and subjected to shocking violence by her family. She had 4 young kids in the refuge with her. A mother of 4 young children, had desperately turned to her parents for help, and they shut the door and pretty much said, "We told you so, we told you he was a waste of space when you married him." They did nothing to help her. And we heard stories from women about seizing a moment, like the one that has absolutely stayed with me, about a beaten woman who was tightly controlled by her partner. She had no access to a car, money, any resources, and he very carefully kept at least one of their kids with him at all times because he knew she'd never leave without them all. And one afternoon he became distracted with his mates, and this woman, by a complete coincidence, had the car keys and the kids, and she put the children in the car and she'd drive and drive until she was almost out of petrol. She went to a police station in a small town, and she was eventually directed to Te Whakaruho, and who helped her on her path. They actually sent her to Australia because of the very, very dangerous nature of the man who she had been with. Another woman who was married to a very influential Waikato man who was also violent and controlling. This woman found a brief window to leave when she was absolutely certain her husband would be in a meeting, and Te Whakaruho staff helped her pack her things while another staff watched the man's car, her husband's car, in the car park, and she got away. And I should probably say here that Te Whakaruho, although it is a Maori women's refuge and has a particular kaupapa of non-judgmental work for everyone, women come there from all races and creeds, and they work with everyone. Venetia and I were guided throughout our work by Te Whakaruho's chief executive, by Ronnie and Ariana, who we saw at the beginning, and they are impressive and big-hearted women. They've been on duty for battered women since the days of their start-up in their one-bedroom flat, and they also, during that time particularly, they worked on the risky front line to help women get away from violent men. And Ronnie used to say that back in the day, she often took her bull mastiff dog kauri on call-outs, and he looked pretty scary. We've seen photos of him, he's dead now. And she said to us it was just as well that no one knew that he was soft as butter on the inside, and he was scared of things like chirping crickets. But, you know, he had the look, so there you go. And Ronnie and Ariana, of course, know better than anyone else about the needs of abused women, about their courage and the endless questions and myths around domestic violence. And Ronnie said to us that there is so much judgment of abused women, but unless you've walked in their shoes, you will not be able to comprehend their stories. She said to us that abused women are fragile, they find it hard to engage with the system, hard to set up a new home again, they've often got no money and no resources, and they may still actually love the man who beats them. He may be a good dad to his kids. Sometimes they face the pressure of wider family to stay, and sometimes it's simply easier to go back to him than to start again. And statistics show that leaving is the most dangerous time, and that's when a woman may be killed. And Venetia's going to be talking about that later. But at Te Whakaruruhau, they keep the door open for battered women 24/7, and they welcome them back multiple times, 7 on average, they say, before someone finally makes that final break and leaves. And they help them gather strength for the next round each time. Yeah, it's all based on their unique kaupapa of non-judgmental care and unconditional kindness, and its flexibility. And it also works with men. It has programs for men, and Venetia's going to talk about that as well. So the work is complex and hard, and Venetia and I believe that women like Ronnie and Ariana, who we met, and others, are the unsung heroes in our community. A battered woman said of Te Whakaruruhau to me, I came into a place where they opened their arms to me and to my children. I've never had that, even from my own family. I never had anyone say, I'm here for you. So it was a privilege for us to tell their story.
Thank you, Denise. So I'm going to talk about our cover girl, whose name is Mariana Love.
Hello.
Yes, lovely name. I've chosen her because she represents both the horror and the hope of domestic violence. So the photo on the cover of it is her at her mother's grave, and that's in Whanganui. And the photographer went down there to take a picture of her, which was the place that she wanted to be photographed. She's holding a picture of her mother. It's very hard to see there, but her mother first came to the attention of Te Whakaruruhau when she was just a young mother herself. So this is Mariana's story. I'm just going to read an excerpt from it. On the day she was murdered, Leonie Newman, a 24-year-old mother of 3, was at a Huntley house with a man who had been her boyfriend in college. Leon Wilson, 28, an affiliated Black Power member, who phoned her from Waikeria prison and suggested they get back together on his release. She told her kids he was choice. He promised to buy her daughter a bike. In 1994, Leonie picked him up from jail. The kids sat in the back seat as he packed his gear in the boot. They watched him warily. Their mother's previous partner had also been a Black Power member. They remembered the bashings and their mother's screams. The pair and Leonie's 2 children went to Huntley, where Wilson's family lived, but the beatings began almost immediately. Leonie fled to Whanganui, where she had grown up. The children were sent to stay with their stepfather's relatives. The night before her murder, Leonie called her best friend and told her, I'm going to get my kids. Everything will be okay, she said. The day after the phone call, June the 3rd, 1996, Wilson saw Leonie driving through Huntley in a blue Cortina. He jumped on a push bike and followed her to a house. He persuaded her to return to a relative's house where they had coffee and spotted a small amount of cannabis oil. When Leonie said a friend had told her not to talk to him, Leon struck her in the mouth with his right fist, knocking her out her front tooth. He grabbed a white karate belt from a bedroom and wrapped it around her throat. As she struggled to breathe, Leonie reportedly told Leon he was the only man she loved. Then she lost consciousness. Wilson took a boning knife from the kitchen and stabbed her 28 times. She had the words "property of Leon" tattooed on her face. When Leonie's daughter Mariana heard her mother was never coming to pick her up again, she didn't believe it. Mum was a strong woman, she says, she always got back up. 22 years after her mother's death, Mariana Love is a loving mother and has in a relationship and has her own 18-month-old son, whom she describes as my miracle child. He has black curls and a serious face. Mariana says Leonie would have loved him like she loved her own kids. She misses her mother daily and visits her grave at Ratana Pa near Whanganui, where she now lives with her family. Another son, stillborn at 28 weeks, who she named Stalin, is buried with his nanny Leonie. As an adult, she looks back on her mother's life with sadness and anger, but also with realism. Mum was no angel, she says. She chased drugs, men, parties and gang pads. She never wanted to get married and tied down with a home and family. But when she was with us, she was an awesome mum. She remembers her mother heading out to a party one night wearing a beautiful black velvet and lace dress and gumboots. She remembers often waking to find Leonie had left in the night, but there were always presents at Christmas and birthdays and postcards. One was posted at a post box just down the road from where they lived. Leonie wasn't a great cook, she says. She roasted peanuts that turned out like charcoal. She made great hot dogs, and fish and chips feasts were delivered with a flourish like they were 10-course meals. Once Leonie baked her a birthday cake shaped like a pig's head. Mariana was allowed to cut off the snout. She hated it when her mother brushed her hair. Leonie would rip the knots out and say, "Do you want something to cry about?" Mariana would give anything to have her hair brushed again by her mum. She remembers her mother's smile. People say I look like my mum, especially my smile, she says. That pleases her. But she also remembers the bashings. I used to watch her get crazy hidings from men. Once I saw her head pushed through a wardrobe wall. Another time, when she and her two younger brothers were making mud pies in the garden, she heard screams from inside the house. I told my brothers to make sure the pies didn't burn and went inside. Mum was crouched in the corner wearing a one-piece lacy teddy while my stepdad stood over her. The neighbours called the police. He told them it was just a domestic. There were times when Leonie would wake in the night and bundle them into the car to take them to a refuge or to hide in the bush. Mariana can still remember the car leather and the petrol. When her mother died, Mariana made a promise on her casket that she would never let any man beat her. In 1996, Leon Colin Wilson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 10 years before being eligible for parole. In 2011, when he breached his parole and went on the run, police warned the public not to approach him. He was later found hiding in a wardrobe in a Huntley house. So Mariana came to Hamilton to be interviewed for this book. I remember Denise and I were both there, introduced to her by Ronnie Albert. Ronnie used to tell the story of Leonie Newman whenever she spoke about the work of Tupou Whakaruruho, because she had a special relationship with Leonie. She knew she was a bit of a party girl, but she also knew that she really loved her kids and wanted to try to get out of the relationships that she was in. So we feel that Mariana represents, as I say, both the horror and the hope of domestic violence. Just an update to this story, Leonie Colin Wilson was jailed again last year for the murder of a man near Tauranga. He was a young gang member and he was murdered by 3 men, and Leon Colin Wilson was regarded as the ringleader. So he's now back in jail for a 10-year term. So that's Mariana's story.
Thank you, Venetia. So next, I'm going to talk about Mel Leonard, and Mel is that lovely woman there in that photo, and she's actually outside the very early refuge at Te Whakaruruho. That was the first house after the flat, after Ronnie and Ariana's house, flat that they managed to secure. That house, they still own that house. It's adjacent to the very modern enclave that you saw the pictures of earlier. And we asked Ronnie when we were writing the book, that we said we want a success story, a really solid success story of someone who has come through the refuge and their life has gone in an upward trajectory where they've done some important things in their life. And Ronnie immediately said, Mel Leonard. And Mel is now a senior sergeant in police. She was at Wairau when I did that interview. She came to Hamilton, she came to Taupo, I was interviewing her there, but she came up to have her photo taken, and she is now the senior sergeant at Waipakarau. And Mel's story is uplifting. She came to the refuge as a young woman. It's about 20 odd years ago, with her 2 sons. Left her husband, a very controlling and then subsequently violent husband, and suffered all those feelings of worthlessness that we had encountered. But Mel decided that she wanted to do something else with her life. And when her youngest son was about to go to school, and she was talking to Work and Income about coming off benefit and what she might do next, Mel said to her Work and Income supervisor that she was wondering about the police force, and the supervisor said to her, "Have you got a plan B?" The implication was that Mel was never going to make it as a police officer, and didn't even, just brushed that aside and said, and as I've said in the book, Mel got her dander up and thought, "I'll show you." And she got fit, she aced her police exams, she aced the fitness, and she has she was deployed to East Timor some years ago. She's worked with the Pike River families as a police liaison officer. She's done some stellar things, and I had the privilege of being her marriage celebrant at her wedding. She got married, I don't know, it was just a few months after we finished the book, and she and I had struck up quite a relationship, and she asked me if I would conduct her wedding ceremony, which I did in Taupo, and I met one of her senior police, I don't know, high up the ranks, and he said to me that Mel was the finest police college that he had encountered for a very long time. So that is a great story. But I'm going to read an extract from Mel's book, because it does talk about some of the control that not only physical violence, but the power and control that women experience, and Mel was one of those. And I might say that with this chapter, like most of the chapters that we did, this was very, very widely canvassed in Mel's family. Her 2 sons read the story because they're still in touch with their dad. Her husband-to-be read the story at that time. I think her police senior officers read it. When I said at the beginning that we really brought a duty of care to this book, each word was, I think, dissected in detail, wasn't it, Denisha? So this is a little bit about Mel, who married very young. She was determined to be a good wife and mother, and this is so partway through the chapter, and she and her husband moved to Hamilton for a fresh start when Mel was 18. She was a stay-at-home mum, and when Winiata, her eldest son, went to school, she took a job at McDonald's in Frankton, eventually moving up to manager level. The first decade of her marriage was strong and positive, and she had a second son, Sean, after a gap of 9.5 years. As she gained maturity and confidence, she began to outgrow her husband. At the same time, he became more and more controlling and psychologically abusive. It took Mel a while to figure out what was happening. At first, she thought she was a lucky young woman, that he loved her so much and wanted to phone her constantly. He'd call 10 or 12 times a day. This was from landlines in the 1990s. He was stalking me, she said, on the phone, wanting to know what I was doing and who I was with. Even now, I hate getting calls on my home phone. He turned the family finances over to Mel to manage, and she thought that was lucky too, but it was kind of a reverse control. He'd blame her if she didn't provide money for him to do the things he wanted. Mel also didn't think she had a choice about having sex with him. If he wanted to, that's what mattered. She got to know the look. She'd be having a good time somewhere, and then it was too much of a good time and she'd get a look that said, rein it in or I'll rein it in for you. Physical abuse began soon after they came home from a holiday. Began after they came home from a holiday with her parents. There was an argument and her husband dragged her from the car and beat her. She bundled up the kids and drove to her grandmother's house in Hamilton. She was crying and upset. In the morning, her grandmother told her to go home to her husband. She did, and she tried to keep him happy, but the abuse escalated. She'd wake in the morning to find him standing over her in bed, glaring down at her. He'd punched the pillow beside her. She felt he'd begun to hate her. Once when he hit her, she passed out. The violence happened when the boys were asleep or away, and she ran away again and again to her mother's house in Auckland. Her husband always came after her, relentlessly stalking and calling her. She said, I decided to go back. I really understand why women do this. He wore me down. I had no money. I was worried about the effect on my mum. I was worried about the boys being out of school. People thought we had a perfect marriage. I hid things well. I didn't want to upset my family and friends. Didn't want the shame and failure. There was no violence in my parents' marriage. They had always had high hopes for me. I didn't want to fail at this. When she was driving back to Hamilton, her eldest son began crying and begged her not to go back. He had also been beaten and controlled by his father. Mel saw how it affected him. It took her about 18 months to make the final break. During that time, she found Te Whakaruraho in the phone book and she went to see Ronnie Albert. Mel said, that was it for me. She opened my eyes. I met this tough-as lady. She asked for my story and she pointed out all the control tactics my husband was using over the finances and phone calls, and she told me I had the right to say no to sex, even if he was my husband. She asked me if I'd felt like I was walking on eggshells. I'd never heard that expression before. Yes, I was. My meeting with Ronnie blew me away. Her tipping point came sometime later after an incident between her husband and her eldest son. Mel feared deeply for her boys. She knew she had to leave. And that, and there's, obviously more to that chapter, and it is about how she joined the police force. And of course she now, in her job, and particularly when she was in Wairoa, she works with abused women all the time, and who better to support them and to help steer them in a different direction than Mel. And I'm just going to read the very last piece of the book where she says, I love my job in the police. I've done so much in my career. This is me. I've been so blessed. There are so many positives. I like being able to empower people and to make a difference. What I'm most proud of, though, are my two sons. They are such good men, and neither of them would ever think about hurting their partner. When I think about my kids and what their future could have looked like, it is my biggest victory. And as Venetia knows, last week I got a text from Mel to say that she and John, her husband, were at the hotel in Taupo on their second wedding anniversary, and they were thinking about that great day when they got married, and they just texted me to say hello. And so the story is a very happy ending. It's nice, and he's a gorgeous man.
As Denise said, the women who work in the refuge are women who have experienced what the women they work with go through, and that is their power. They understand it. They know about walking forward, they know about stepping back, they know that this takes a long time, and their attitude towards keeping women safe includes the fact that they've got to also work with men to make sure that when women choose to go back into a relationship which has been violent, that the men are going to be better able to behave better. And this is very powerful. It's quite a strong direction that they've taken there, and not in line with some other groups who only work with women and believe that that is their primary duty to look after women. And we were very understanding of that and could see the point in that, because when I talk about the men, you will understand and realise how change takes a long time. It's nothing that happens overnight. It's not some magical moment where a man decides, I can't be like this anymore. But sometimes that change will happen, and a realisation of the damage that they've done. So I went to interview 4 men who had abused their partners, and we're working with Te Whakaruruhau male advocates to try to change their behaviour. And we met at the office of Te Whakaruruhau in Hamilton, and one of the male advocates had cooked a meal for the men. So we all sat around the table, had some great curry. It was a curry, and it was apparently his specialty dish. And then the 4 men who had agreed to talk to me spoke about their own situations and what had happened. So I'm just going to read you a couple of their stories. They're very short to show how these things develop. This is Nikura's story. Nikura is a softly spoken man who chooses his words carefully. His wife, Zania, seated beside him, occasionally touches his arm. They've known each other for 18 years. He's into his 2nd year studying environmental planning at Waikato University. For the interview, he wears a tweed jacket, a collar and tie, and freshly pressed slacks. The small black electronic ankle bracelet is hidden out of sight. Nikura was sentenced in March 2018 to 11 months home detention for punching his 8-year-old son in the face. The day after the incident, when the same son hit his youngest sister, Nikura punched him again. He was modelling my behaviour, he says now. Nikura was referred to police by a relative on the day his youngest son was born. He was told by Sif he had 3 choices. He could leave his home immediately, Zania could leave with the couple's 6 children, or the kids would be removed. He moved out. During his sentence, he's not allowed to have contact with his children without supervision. Nikura makes no excuses for his behaviour. He says stress contributed. Zania was in and out of hospital before the birth of their youngest child, and the couple had had very little sleep. His upbringing was a factor. He was hit as a child and told the beatings would make him a man. He knows now that that isn't right, and has told his son what Papa did was wrong. The refuge, he says, looks at him as an individual and treats him with respect and dignity. They believe our family has potential. A year from now, he sees a better future. Zania is studying environmental law, and they hope to work in the same field. As a family, we want to be together. We'll be wiser as a result of this. I want to ensure our sons aren't in the dock facing charges of assault. And this is Rua's story. Rua is only 30, from Ngaruawahia. He was whangai to his grandparents, who he says were good people. But by his late teens, he was set on a course of destruction. There were charges of aggravated robbery and arson, stretches in Waikeria, gang affiliations and drug use. He met his partner, Mahuri, on Facebook. She was 8 years younger than him. He was into marijuana, she was a heavy drinker. He says he had trust issues. We didn't trust each other, which led to arguments. She miscarried their first child. She gave up alcohol when she became pregnant again. He was stoned in the delivery room when their daughter was born. They now have 2 children. Rua says he was torn between 2 worlds, his gang and his family. I had to ask my gang captain for permission to see my kids. Mahuri gave him an ultimatum. I saw them and he chose his family. Then they had another argument and he grabbed her by the neck. I've never done that before, he says. She phoned the police and Rua was charged with intent to injure. During the interview and waiting for his court appearance, he says he doesn't want to live the lifestyle he's seen others lead. I want to be the best dad. I want to be there for my kids and give them love and support. I won't hide my past. I don't want to be a hypocrite. I want to be different. He also says the support of Te Whakaruruhau is crucial as he moves forward. So those are 2 of the men who the Te Whakaruruhau male advocates were working with at the time. And these are our 2 male advocates, and they've just gone to sleep again, so we may need to bring back the technician so you can see them. They are remarkable men in all sense of the words. They are huge, man mountains, and you wouldn't want to come up against them or cross them in any way. But both of them have been abusers. Both of them have experienced abuse, so they are the best people to talk and help the men that they are now dealing with. So their names are Eric Edmonds and Adam Wharemate Sadler Dobson. They walked in the shoes of the men that they work with every day. Eric's early life centred around drugs and alcohol. He intimidated his wife with taunts and emotional abuse. Adam was brought up to follow in his father's footsteps. His father ran with the mongrel mob and was a perfectionist and a strict disciplinarian. So there they are, there. Eric on the left, and Adam on the right. Adam's father raised his son to intimidate and cause pain to all those he came across. Adam never used his fists or his boot on his partner, but he took pleasure in making her feel worthless. His kids cowered at his rage. Their stories are similar. Anger was at the heart of their behaviour, so was power and control. Pride contributed. To admit there was a problem was a sign of weakness, easier to show strength through determination and domination. They hear the same stories from their clients, men who have physically or mentally abused their partners and kids, or those who have pulled back from the brink of abuse. It's a strong man who confronts his own violent behaviour, they say. It takes courage to change. Their own experience has taught them it brings rewards. Each of these men works with 20 men referred by police who have been convicted of family violence, are going through the courts or deemed at risk. Their work, which includes ongoing care and support, underscores the refuge's conviction that men should not be excluded from intervention programs and that support for them is essential to stop violence in homes. Work on the front line can be tough even for men of this size. Some men they deal with have long histories of violence. Many have gang affiliations. The first step is to get past the F-off entry point and break down the barriers, they say. Eric sometimes rocks up on a motorbike. If perpetrators are known to resist or to have firearms charges, he'll check out the property. I know the dangers because I was that sort of person. He's worked as a corrections officer where he learned to assess risk. Sometimes they worked in pairs or alongside the women advocates. Sharing their own stories helps to build trust. Some men see it as a sign of weakness to admit there is a problem. They want to be the father provider. If they admit they're struggling, they may get a backlash from their partner. Some also see it as a weakness to talk to another man. Eric tells them he was in the same place and had a lot of stuff locked inside. You must create an atmosphere where they feel comfortable to talk their stuff, he says. Once they've built trust, they talk about options. These two men are both Christians, but they don't preach. They say each person has an individual path. For some it will be about help with anger management or budgeting or parenting skills. They talk to them about organisations like Hamilton Abuse Intervention Project and Man Up, a community-based program. Eric says many men don't understand why they do what they do. Others are influenced by gang behaviour. The key is to get them to a place where they are calling the shots and making the right decisions, and to surround them with the right people. The wrong people can trigger violence. Children can often be the motivation for change, says Adam. They start acting out like their fathers, and their fathers are freaked out by that. That was his experience. It shocked him to his boots. They say the work pushes them and they've learned to stretch. It's a polishing process, not a punishing one, says Eric. They're uplifted by signs of progress and gratified that many men reunite with their partners and children after making changes. Eric and his wife celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary this year. This was 2018. He says the first 17 years was hell for her. The second is a journey. They've had to let a lot of things go and work on their future. If you heal the man, you heal the home, he says. Now, while these men are big men and more than capable of holding their own if they ever run into violence, we also met some of the women who are the frontline workers and who go out and often confront men because the men are keeping a very close eye on their women. And I interviewed one woman who went out and was immediately approached by a man who was swearing at her and asking her who she was. And she spoke to him in Te Reo. She reduced herself in size to a person who was not intimidating, and she wasn't a large woman. And she gave him her first name. That's all the detail that she gave him. And so he let her come inside, and his partner was sitting in the kitchen, and she knew that she couldn't let him know that she was from the women's refuge, otherwise she'd be booted down the road. So she just sat and chatted to the woman as if she was a friend, talked a little bit about budgeting and the hardness of that. He eventually left the room, but she could hear him in the next room and she knew he was listening, so all her words were directed to him through her, and she came back 2 or 3 times, and eventually he would come into the kitchen and sit with them while she was talking to his partner. So there are different ways of working through those barriers, but confronting somebody, butting up against them initially is likely to cause the wrong result and possibly end up with more violence. So there are a lot of skills involved here, and it's never about fists or, beating down the door.
And the staff always work in pairs. They would very, very rarely go out on their own, which is a safety protocol that they have. So the last of the people in the book that we're going to introduce you to is Manawatu and her beautiful little children. That photograph was taken at Hamilton Lake. Manawatu had fled from the South Island with her children to Te Whakaruruhau. She was guided there from a refuge in Ashburton where it was unsafe to be in her hometown because at the refuge there, because everyone knew the man he knew where she was, and it wasn't safe. Manawatu's children, for that photo, before I read an extract, got dressed up. They had very little. The children just had little backpacks that they arrived in Hamilton with very few personal things, and their wonderful Te Whakaruruhau Kaumahi, their advocate, Tania Thompson, went out for the photo shoot to farmers with the children, and she bought them each those dear little outfits that they're wearing, a little top and a pair of trousers. And at the end of the shoot, Peter Drury, who is the photographer and he's a very good friend of Venetia's and myself, he and I were, chatting away to the children, and one of them said to Tania, who bought them the clothes, "Do we have to give our new clothes back now?" And honestly, I could see Pete, who's quite a hard-bitten photographer, his eyes welled up with tears as mine. I'm almost tearful telling that story, and I think of my grandkids, little hothouse flowers with wardrobes full of clothes that they'll probably never, wear, and all of them. And these 4 little kids wondered if they'd have to give their new clothes back, because probably pretty much everything they had been given to them from the Te Whakaruruhau op shop. So, and of course they got to keep their clothes, and we shouted them chicken nuggets for dinner that night as a thank you for their photo shoot. And Manawatu, their mum, is a very brave and strong woman, and this is part of her story, and really part of this chapter is showing how Te Whakaruruhau gets people into a home and sometimes absolutely furnishes it from scratch for people who have nothing. And they do this, it's where we found out about the wonderful warehouse that they have, where they just have untold resources to pass on to their families. So we meet Manawatu as that she's moving into a house. She's just been in the refuge, and she's got her own home. A fridge is unloaded at Manawatu's new home. Te Whakaruruhau volunteer Nigel does the heavy lifting, and he asks Manawatu if she'd like him to unpack it. "No thank you," she says, "I'll do it. I don't expect people to do things for me. I don't expect any of this." Nigel quietly goes ahead anyway. He unpacks the fridge, sets it up in a space by the back door, and he and Te Whakaruruhau warehouse manager Anne Rifarifa depart in the large green van that ferries furniture and goods to refuge families across town. They're off to pick up a couch for another family. Manawatu has just moved into her home in Hamilton, a 3-bedroom rental close to a rambling suburban block of shops. It's a handy spot for someone without a car. Her new fridge has been financed through a work and income grant. Everything else, down to the last teaspoon and pillowcase, has come from the Te Whakaruruhau network. people she only met when she and her 4 children fled from a town down south to safety in the north. In the space of a month, she has been taken under the refuge's wing, teamed up with advocate Tanya Thompson, and she made the transition from safe house to independence. Tanya sits with Marinea in her sunny sitting room as she talks about the bumpy pathway to her new home. Tanya has walked every step with her since she arrived in Hamilton. Marinea came with only the things she could carry on the plane: clothes for her kids and herself, a bag of personal papers and photographs, and some treasured items that reflect the life and death of a baby son, Tioni, born prematurely at 27 weeks. A greenstone plaque honouring her baby is on a shelf in the living room. She said, "I packed up my whole house, got rid of everything, and I gapped it. My ex-boyfriend was violent to me. I left him before Christmas after he gave me a hiding. This had been happening on and off for 3 years. I was hoping he would leave me alone. I moved from Auckland to a town down south, but he found out where I was and he followed me. I wasn't safe in my own town, and he started using our daughter, Marinea's youngest child, as a weapon. He wanted me back. He wanted to control me. It didn't faze me anymore when he hit me, so he tried to hurt me by using my daughter. He took her for the day and refused to return her. I went to the police, and they said that because I didn't have parenting orders in place and because he was the father, they couldn't help me. They said I was an inconvenience in their town. I was in the middle of getting parenting and protection orders and not getting a lot of support from my lawyer. I got the protection order just before I left." She said she'd had a hard upbringing as a child and her parents turned their back on her over what was happening with her boyfriend. They said I was the idiot who kept going back. Don't expect us to help you. I've had other abusive relationships. I said that 2018 was the year I was going to break that chain and not let my kids see violence. No more violence. I've tried to shield them from that. I want to start again. And again, the last line is, I learned that you don't always have to do it all on your own, and this is what she learned from Te Whakarurahau. And if you are in a happy place, then your kids are going to be in a happy place. I want my kids to be happy, that's all I've ever wanted.
Denise talked about her moving into a house and the impact of that and feeling safe in that house, and we also talked to the Corrections Department because of their close affiliation with Te Whakarurahau and also because of the importance of working with men who are incarcerated. And one of the things they talked about, some years ago they developed a scheme where working parties would go out of prison and work on some of the houses that Te Whakarurahau was either building or renovating or cleaning up after damage had been done to them. And the man I spoke to from the Corrections Department was full of praise for these projects. He said the impact on the prisoners was significant because they would often be going to places where somebody had been battered and the mess was incredible. Often there was evidence that the family had literally run from the house. There were breakfast dishes that were still not finished. There were kids' toys in the back garden. And the men went in to clean up the house, which was often in an awful state and sometimes with blood. And when they came back, they were so moved by that, and many of them were moved to do things like literacy courses, te reo courses, anger management courses. So they were motivated as a result of seeing the first-hand damage that had been done by other men. Unfortunately, that working party scheme no longer exists. A few years after it was started, there was an incident where a prisoner broke away, not from the Te Whakarurahau group, but from another working party. Corrections got very risk averse and decided it wasn't appropriate anymore to take these working parties into cities where it were. But, you know, it's just an evidence, I think, of when confronted by things which they can see and understand, that can have a huge impact.
That became a chapter in its own right in the book, and Venetia and I didn't even know that this arrangement had existed. It wasn't in our original plan. It hadn't been explained to us. And just in passing, I think Ronnie and Ariana mentioned, oh, you know, when we had prisoners coming in, we went, what? and that just became a whole new chapter, didn't it? Yeah.
Extraordinary people step up to work with Te Whakaruruhau. We also spoke to a man. He's probably the largest Pākehā man I know, but he's also a man with a huge heart, and he works a lot with groups, charities, and he was asked to help them with their early fundraising. And he, part of their fundraising for the enclave that we showed you earlier, he had to do door knocking to try to get people to support it for resource consent. It was down a small cul-de-sac and well away from, you know, the areas where there might be concerns, but he had to door knock, and he says, you know, this huge Pākehā man knocking on the door of these houses saying, I'm with Waikato Women's Refuge Te Whakaruruhau, you know, this look on their faces, and he got permission from all but 2 houses to support this enclave. So a tremendous amount of goodwill that's involved with projects, as you would know. I'm just going to finish up by just talking about some of the myths that exist around domestic violence, and which I had also believed before I started this project. When we had finished the book, I had been doing some writing for North and South magazine, the long, unfortunately lamented now because has sold it, but it's just been re-established, and so hopefully it will rise from the ashes. And when I pitched the idea to the editor, Virginia Larson, for a story around this book, she said, oh gosh, she said, I'd love to, but she said, I've been sort of pushing a lot of social issues through my readers over the last few months, and she said, I just feel like it's a little bit too much for them. But she said, why don't you write a story about what you learned during the year of writing that book? So, you know, what an invitation. So this story appeared under the headline The Hope and the Hurt, which was Virginia's headline,
Nice
it wasn't
illustration.
mine. And it was absolutely perfect for what we have been talking about here, that there is hope, and that from some of the stories that we have reported, the results have been outstanding. But some of the myths continue to exist, and there are many of them, but some of the ones that are fairly typical is it's a crime of the poor and uneducated. It's always physical. The cops and the courts can sort it, it's not our business. And if a woman stays with a man, it can't be that bad. And Denise has talked about the earlier story in relation to that. So the first one, if women don't leave, it can't be that bad. I think I probably believed that at some stage. I thought, why don't they just leave? It's so easy to walk out the door, and boy, was I wrong. As Denise said, women go back to their partners, abusive partners, an average of 7 times. It's a lot of times to go back and get beaten. Leaving an abusive relationship is never easy. Women often love the men who harm them, at least initially. Sometimes their men have been very loving at the start of a relationship, and that relationship has deteriorated, so it takes a while to understand that that's not going to stop. They may worry about the reaction or the rejection by family and friends. They often blame themselves for their partner's violence. I pushed him over the edge. They believe they can change him, or he will change over time. He'll promise over and over never to do it again, saying he was stressed or he was drunk or he was drugged. So they hear that, they believe it. Lack of money may limit their ability to leave. Lack of support may make it hard. He may have isolated her from her family and friends, and that's very typical. Men will sometimes say things like, I had an affair with your best friend, to drive a wedge between a wife and a best friend so that that relationship is disturbed. He may threaten to harm the children or pets. Leaving a partner is the most dangerous time for a woman. Abusers often stalk, harass, threaten or kill women who try to leave. If you remember, Leonie Newman was murdered by Colin Wilson as she attempted to leave him. So those are all reasons why women don't find it easy sometimes to walk out the door. Another myth, abuse always involves physical violence. And what is known is that it is very rare for a physical violence abuse the first act to be a violent one. It may begin with name-calling, threats, possessiveness or isolation. One man, as Denise has alluded to, forced his wife to have sex every day so she would have more kids to keep her tied to him. When he found contraceptives in her handbag, he threatened to kill her dog. Mel Leonard's partner stalked her by phone, so coercion, intimidation, all those things are the practices of violence and make it hard for women to leave. Another one which is widely believed, it's a Maori problem. So easy to label tattooed, coarse, brown-skinned men as potential abusers. And Maori men are overrepresented in the courts. But perpetrators, as Te Whakaruraho kept reminding us, and they saw evidence of it every day, come in all shapes, colours and bank balances.
Yes.
Among them are surgeons, judges, detectives and corporate bigwigs who live in big homes in leafy suburbs. The partners of these men battle shame and public humiliation if they speak out. The perpetrator may be controlling, emotionally manipulative or clever about hiding the physical abuse. He may chip away at her self-worth so she doesn't feel she has the ability to forge out on her own. Some women hide their abuse from their families because they know they'll be told to get out or worse, be disbelieved. Educated women who are abused may feel they stand to lose everything if they leave, especially if he's a respected person in society and she is likely to be disbelieved. Jackie Clark, who some of you may have heard of, who founded The Aunties, a charity that helps women survivors of abuse, was psychologically abused by her husband for more than 2 decades. She says, while people regard abuse as a brown-skin thing, women over here in higher socio-economic communities believe they are alone, and that's a source of shame. They don't do anything about it until it's too late. And a final one, I think, as a representative of the media, as both of us are, I believe, and I wrote in the article, that media contribute to some of these myths. They share the blame for perpetuating stereotypes and downplaying the horror of domestic violence. A woman attacked at random out jogging is far more newsworthy than a woman getting beaten by her partner by the media. The coverage of the Grace Mullane murder, you'll remember that in stark detail, ghastly as it was, received huge coverage. Yet, as Denise has said, 13 women on average are killed by their partner every year in New Zealand, and they never make the front page, unless they happen to be somebody well known. By just reporting the statistics and allocating those stories to back pages, we risk normalising domestic violence, and I think now we all have some duty to bring it forward in conversations, to talk about it, to reveal, to discuss, and to try as far as we can to bring change in our own communities. So that's it from us. We're now open to questions.
We're going to talk about the next book.
Oh, I'm sorry,
yes,
we are
yes.
too, and look, we've lost this again, Denise.
And then we'll do questions. So
that's all right. We don't need that. It's all right. We can talk without
it's okay.
that. It's just one
we
slide.
We can indeed.
Sorry.
Thanks,
Do we want to
Venetia.
do the questions before we talk about the next book? So we can
Why don't we do
and then
that?
we can just
Yes.
wind up.
Yeah, we'll just wind up and talk to you a little bit.
Yeah.
Does
So-
that sound okay? We'll take some questions now. Good idea.
Any questions, statements, stories, anything that you've heard that you'd like us to reflect on as
Or
well?
elaborate on.
What serendipitous event brought you to this?
To the book. Venetia and I have both been around town quite a long time, as journalists, and so has Ronnie Albert's been around town a long time. I had interviewed her several times wearing my Waikato Times hat, a reporter, feature writer hat, and so she kind of knew us. And
She'd asked another woman to write the book.
Yes,
And
she had.
yeah, that woman couldn't do it and
Yeah.
contacted us and said,
Yeah.
would we be up for it?
Yeah, she kind of looked around her network, and she contacted me one day and said, come and talk to us, and so Venetia and I did, and
It led on from there, didn't it? Yeah.
It did. And it was a bit daunting because we hadn't written a book before together. And so collaborating for a book is an interesting process. Are any of you writers, authors, any of you? Yes, well there we are. You know what it's like. Sometimes it's a very personal journey. And we knew that this book, we had to be absolutely in tune in how we would write it. We knew we respected each other's writing, but it was how we would collaborate. And if we had very different views, we established from the start that we needed to talk about those to just get around them before
and establishing the tone for the book, our own kaupapa for the book, really, which was airing everything with the people we talked to so that they were entirely comfortable.
It's also important, I think, to step back every now and again, because we were finding that telling these stories, as Denise has said, as journalists we are focused always on the essential element of a story to try to get readers' attention before you move to the background of a story. And this was completely different. It was all about trying to bring the background forward to try to find the story somewhere in the middle. And so we needed to sometimes work out how we were going to continue to do that, because we did get quite a lot of pushback from one or two of the women once the stories had been written and they had been approved. And then there was a period of reflection. And as Denise said, sometimes those stories were taking stuff out and wanting to put things in because they thought about them differently. And one in particular, in fact, Ariana's story, which was a very powerful story of her being brought up in a family of 12 children where her father was abusive. And she became very protective of the community where she was brought up. She didn't want the geographic location revealed. She wanted also for us to understand that she understood why her father was like that. She had become she was an activist, a woman who'd been active in many women's issues, but also in Māori issues. So colonisation was a very real part of how she interpreted male violence and her father's violence. His land had been taken, he was a poor man, he had a lot of pride, he didn't seem to be in control of his finances, the kids, 12 children, for heaven's sakes, that causes stress. And she was more understanding of him. He had died, of course, some years before. More understanding of him than perhaps she had been when she first told the story. So I left for England with the story unapproved, and Denise, bless her, took the story into Ariana and went through it almost line by line, and eventually got her to say, yeah, it's okay.
We got it over the line, and I think working together, we had each other's back. We heard some very tough stories, and I can see some of your reactions when we talked about some of them. But it's hard stuff, and I think being able to debrief with each other was a very important part of writing this book. I remember ringing Venetia after you'd read through the court notes on Leonie Newman's death, and I know Venetia said to me, I just can't talk at the moment, I've just read, and I never read them. I mean, I didn't need to because I hadn't written that chapter, and I thought, I think I won't go there. And so, we did, and being able to debrief was excellent. Anyway, more questions, yes.
Yeah, can I ask sorry. Did you find, as journalists, that it was quite difficult to go through that approval process?
Yes,
you never had to do that for an article.
We're not used to that, and that's not what we typically do, but we were very resolved, of course, that this was a very different circumstances, that this book was commissioned by Te Whakaruruhau. It was their book, their story, not ours.
You're a journalist?
I am.
I thought from your question, you know that it's a very rare thing to get approval before publication, but this was always going to be the way.
Yeah. Did you ever find, I suppose, so I wrote a lot about sexual violence, and because that is an area which is really sensitive, and I want to make sure that the people I'm working with are sort of okay with the stories, the survivors. So sometimes I will sort of work with them to make sure that they're okay with things, but often there can be sort of tension when there are details that they don't necessarily want, but I think would greatly improve the story. So did you have sort of that back and forth where you tried to sort of get things in that they...
Yeah, as I say, particularly in Ariana's story,
especially in Ariana's.
you know, a lot of the detail that was so powerful about how she survived her childhood and her teenagehood, where she was sexually abused by cousins. That was a very powerful part of the story, but a lot of it came out because she thought about how she wanted to tell her story, and that wasn't the way she wanted to tell it.
It's going to upset all the cousins' relations.
Exactly.
The pain on the whole family.
Exactly.
You know, that she did, to people she didn't want to cause them.
And you can't push in a situation like that.
The expression Denise used about duty of care, you know, I wish more journalists reflected on that, because I think many people are very familiar with the media and very sophisticated around the media. Our politicians know how to behave around the media. There is no duty of care to them in my book. But with other people who are not familiar with how the media works and what a story might look like and the impact on them of that story, I think you do have a responsibility to say, well, you had an instance, didn't you, where you phoned somebody to tell them it would be on the front page?
Oh, I did. Yes, I did. This is a story for the Waikato Times, and it was a damn good story. And so the editor said, right, front page, poster, the whole thing. And I thought, oh my God, these people, you know, they knew I was writing the story. But they'll be driving past their dairy on the next morning, and they'll see themselves on a poster. And they wouldn't have been expecting that, and I rang and just talked them through that in advance, that it was going to be on the front page and there would be posters, and just felt it was better to prepare them. They coped extremely well.
Now that you've had some distance between publication and now talking about it, how do you feel this has changed you, either as women or as journalists?
I think for me it's around that what I believe previous to writing the book and what I now believe in how I would approach a conversation probably with anyone. As part of the North and South story, I also spoke to people about what they saw as possible solutions, and they were varied in their views, from a very sort of extreme corrections view of punishment is absolutely appropriate, that's the only way to attack it. It may be to do with things that go further back, like colonisation and social relation and anger and drugs and things, but punishment is definitely, you know, the only approach. And then others who said, no, it is about how we bring up boys to be men, and that's the only place that will start to change. And it will take a long time, but if we start there, the chances are that we're going to have a much better result than just continuing to punish people at the end when they are committing acts of violence and sometimes death.
I think one of the changes for me from this book is speaking up now when I hear people say things that are so untrue about domestic violence or sexual violence. And I won't go in like a battering ram, but I will just say there is another side to that story, or that is actually not correct, or, you know, when people talk about the myth thing, you know, why didn't she leave? And I will just, you know, without making a meal of it, I won't let that go now, and I would have done it at any point in
And if a woman actually told I love you that this was happening to them, what would your advice be?
Well, I think the reference to the women's refuge might be the first thing, that there are some really skilled women who are working in this field, and it might be helpful to have that conversation. It's such an intimate detail to reveal.
It is.
You know, and even with deep friends, I've not been abused, and as far as I know, Denise has not been abused.
and I've not had people come to me and say that to me. But the refuge and if necessary, picking them up and taking them, you know, I would do what I felt I think.
Because in a way, it's actually hard for someone to reach out to you. It's hard,
Yes.
they haven't said anything to anyone, they say something to you, and if you can, if there's a way to help them, You know, you sort of need to do it there and then, because
Yes,
they
that's
might
right.
just go back into their shell
Yes,
and put up with it for another 10 years.
yes,
you know.
that's right. And I think from what we learned from the women, from the frontline workers who work with women who've been abused, the worst thing you can say is, don't go back, or why would you go back, or why don't you just leave him, you know, because there's a judgment
Just
right
walk
there.
out, walk out.
It's, you know, what are you staying around for? And so it takes skill, and I don't know whether I would have the skill to do any more than say I know a very good organisation where women are, you know, able to offer you a lot, and I'm very happy to introduce you or to take you.
With violence, sometimes women are frightened that it's going to be their baby next, you know,
Yes.
and that's pretty frightening.
Yeah.
I think in that case.
Oh, I think
You do want to get
every
away.
mother would say, right, yeah,
Mm.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Do sometimes worry that, you know, having told the story, that there might be repercussions for the people down the road in the future, you know, like because they're kind of out there and they might get filmed or something and
We were very much
Awful
guided
stories.
by Ronnie and Ariana on that. They felt comfortable with the women who we had interviewed, and most of them we've just used first names and not to, although you know they've had their photos taken as well. Some chose not to have their photos taken. Occasionally we changed names when we were asked, but we took our lead from the two boss ladies, and you wouldn't want to mess with either of them.
Strong women.
Yeah, they are strong women, and so I guess in the end we had to say if it was okay with them, we thought it would be okay. Yeah, and we've not heard of any repercussions for those people who were brought. Yeah.
What about legal issues with publishing? Like, did you come up?
There was a legal question.
Yes,
It was to
there
do
was,
with
yes.
Leon Colin Wilson, the man who murdered Leonie Newman. And at the time we were writing the book, he was actually, the charges about his
We're still going through.
we're still
that.
going through, and because he had been named in the previous court case, and I named him in the story, and I got a call from
His
Whakaruru,
lawyer.
who
Oh,
is
right.
saying, do we need to run this past a lawyer because this could be used to get him off, sub judice, absolutely. But because he had not yet been named in the current case, there was that little window of opportunity, you know that as a journalist, before you can or cannot name someone. And so we decided it was worth the risk because he had been named for the previous crime, he'd done his time, and therefore it was fact. And he had not been named with the current crime, so that was how we got
That's
around it.
clever, yes.
Yeah, but
Logical.
no other legal issues
No.
that I knew of.
No, I don't think so. No, well, no, there weren't. No.
How has this changed your view as journalists, writers and women as to what's important to be done in the modern world, as all of us writers, journalists and women?
Phew, well, I think that I think sharing these stories, telling these stories, celebrating the work that is being done. We do some wonderful work in New Zealand, and seeing the work done by Te Whakaruru has certainly changed me. Seeing the grassroots women who absolutely give no quarter to keep women safe. That has to make you think that there are many, many generous and good people in our community, and you know we're seeing it in this book second book that we're writing too. So that's very good.
Look, I think journalism is in a state of absolute turmoil at the moment. I mean,
absolutely.
truly, I try to remain optimistic. There's some excellent work being done by journalists, and it's available to all of us now, and we can access it. But the money question is still such a crucial one for them to sort out. you know, that I'd love to see more contextual journalism, more understanding of big issues, more reflective journalism. That takes time. It takes money.
Yeah.
It takes,
It took
you
us
know,
And then
Not
publishing as
time.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, and
Because they want the
so-
one-line headline, like you say, something that grabs people,
Yeah,
that
and
only
often-
takes 7 seconds to take in.
And it's not just in women's issues
Yeah,
or
it's-
issues to do with violence or homelessness. It's about trying to make sense of the world now that we have all this information, helping us to make sense of it. And is this really serious, or is this just a small thing? And I think that's our responsibility. And I feel for, I mean, Sinead Boucher, for heaven's sake, she's just bought stuff. You know, how brave is that?
It's
Yeah.
amazing.
And she's employing some great journalists, but
she
that
is.
must be hard. It must be really hard. She's got a lot of jobs on the line there.
There's a lot of support out there though.
There is a lot of
There
support.
is, isn't there, and respect.
Yeah.
Just for me, I sat there and listened to those COVID things that we had at 1 o'clock, and it was like, weren't you first taught never to ask a closed question? I just sat there, closed question after closed question after closed, but they get away with it because they're politicians and they want to give the, you know, just for me, I thought the standard has gone down since Hunter Wells took over and told everyone to say there was a tragedy in Wairau today because 5 cats got run over, instead of just saying 5 cats got run over and you decide it's a tragedy.
Yes.
Yeah, that emotionalisation of it,
I
yeah.
think Venetia and I are at a point now in our lives where we can devote ourselves. We can.
Yeah,
we can
that's
forget
lovely,
about,
but it's timely,
some
isn't
of that.
it? Yes.
Venetia's, but we can devote ourselves to some social
Project
justice
like this.
projects
Righty.
that you know, that and I particularly. That we
Well, thank you for
particularly
doing so,
enjoy.
because we need you ladies.
And that's a luxury at this point in our very long careers as journalists, to be able to tell those wonderful grassroots stories.
But thank you for doing so, because you could have just gone gardening and played golf and whatnot.
There's a breadth in the impact of the book too, because I think that people will see it and think, oh, it's not just me. A lot of people think this is only happening to them. They're alone in their suffering. And just seeing the book, and perhaps standing there in a bookshop and looking through it and thinking, good heavens, this
This might be
is
the one thing that they go, okay, I will go get help.
Yeah, well, we've got some for sale for $20, and it all goes to the women's refuge.
that's
Oh, cool.
fantastic.
Okay, right.
That's lovely.
So,
Can I just ask another question about the reporting side of things? I mean, before you said that this was at risk of being normalised, I would argue that it already is. So what can we do to make it seem abnormal? You know, like what kind of reporting would make a difference at this point, do you think?
It is a good question, and I think I've been an editor, so I understand what motivates people to buy media, you know, and that in the end, bottom line is the way that media continue. They can't ignore that. But I think it's the way you tell these stories and the way you engage with people that maybe gets around that, oh, it's just another domestic violence story. There's something perhaps that you can connect with an audience that just brings it into their consciousness rather than another one of those. We do it with the Grace Millane stories. We do it with the Sounds...
Hope and Smart.
Yes,
I mean,
we do. Yep.
I was an editor during that time, and you know that story went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. They were a young, white, beautiful couple, and they went missing. You know, and it was a story that gripped everybody. Maori women who are getting battered and bashed, or people who are in their homes and you know sort of suffering that just doesn't.
But the Stuff Circuit investigative team is doing some really good reporting. I really rate what they're doing. I mean, it's really mostly only available online. I don't know whether you probably are aware. Florence Kerr, who is...
Yeah, she's in my team.
Is she?
Yeah,
Oh, right.
yeah, I love Flo. She's
She's
amazing.
based in Hamilton. She has told some really good domestic violence, some stories, some very thoughtful stories about domestic violence. And she's a journalist who is particularly good at gaining people's trust and working with them very seriously. She's got the luxury of being able to spend quite a long time on a reporting project. And you know, I look at people like her, who I now think are telling those those stories particularly well.
In this story, I wrote that I was the deputy editor of the Waikato Times when Leon Wilson was murdered. Liam Wilson murdered Leonie Newman. And I wrote that what we recorded was the court story, the fact that he had throttled her so hard he broke his thumb. That was the sensation. And then I wrote, the newspaper didn't tell Newman's backstory. It was never reported that she was a terrible cook. Presented kids with takeaway fish and chips. So it's that depth that's trying to connect through, a human understanding of a real person rather than just the fact that a murder has taken place or somebody has been violated. I think that's the way to tell the stories that I would read now, and I hope others
So
would.
that you get a real sense of the person.
And the person, not the victim.
And you did that really well in that first chapter that you guys read from the book, talking about her mum.
Yes.
Yes.
And Mariana said my mother was no angel. She was a ratbag. She chased drugs, she chased gangs, but she was still a human being, and she was deserving of more than just that sort of note that she'd been killed.
So has this book come out of when you were here 2 or 3 years ago? You were here 2 or 3 years ago, weren't you?
In Fielding,
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I must have seen that.
2 other women of our age.
Yes.
No. So it's a really impressive book.
Thank you.
Very good to see.
Thank you.
Well, Denise will just spend 5 minutes talking about our next book.
Yes.
because
Oh, that's right, yes, let's hear about it.
we're moving
I will
on.
wave that up at you, and this is embryonic. Well, we're actually on the last lap with it. This is a draft. It's going to be called The Open Door, and it's about the People's Project in Hamilton, which has really set the benchmark for housing homeless people in New Zealand.
Fantastic.
And they started in 2015, and I started writing some stories about it for the Waikato Times, and it's kind of led on from there that we've ended up doing what they've asked us to do as a book project to capture the first 5 or 6 years of their history. The People's Project was the first group in New Zealand to implement housing first, which seems to be the most successful way to house homeless people. It's based on a North American model which was pioneered by Dr. Sam Simberis, and the premises is quite straightforward, and it works, and that you get homeless people off the street into a house, you get a roof over their head, and then you look at what their needs are, which are huge, and you provide the wraparound care services to actually keep them in their house, because without that they'll tip straight back out, and they have been extremely successful in housing. They pretty much housed the historic Hamilton homeless community when they first began with about 80 people, and but of course it's gone on enormously from there. They've got an office in Garden Place, right in the heart of town, and they are amazing people. It's like the Te Whakaruaho people. They are absolutely invested in their clients and homeless people, and they will do anything and everything for them, and they say whatever it takes to keep them in a house. They will, they'll take them to an income, they'll take them to Housing New Zealand, they'll take them to a dentist, a doctor, they'll take them to get their bunions fixed on their feet, just everything. And the Housing First has been picked up by the government in the last year's 2019 wellbeing budget. Millions of dollars were devoted to rolling out Housing First in other areas in the country, and you'll hear that phrase a lot from now on. That Housing First is the method, or the best modus operandi for.
So when's this book coming out?
Well,
Hopefully the end of the year.
hopefully the end of the year.
That's really good.
It's just we're just going through revisions, and it's the same thing that we encountered with this, that with this book, that the people whose stories we're telling, they read it and they need to approve it, and they're making some changes. not all of which we would like to see, but that's what is happening, and it is their book, and we're just about to start the photo shoots for it. But it's an exciting project, and there's been a whole new chapter that we've done, of course, post-COVID, where the government came up with money to get everyone off the street and into motels, and so some really hardcore homeless people came off the street because they were frightened. I mean, if COVID had gone through the homeless communities, that would have been they were seriously at risk, and so they're in motels. It's not a permanent solution, but the funding is being extended to next April, and so in Hamilton, the People's Project is working one by one with the people who are in motels, finding permanent solutions.
So where do you get these books? Do you have to go through, where do you get hold of these books? Do you have to go through the organisations like People's Project when they're
bookshops,
published?
Yeah, when it's published, the Te Whakaruruhau book has been available in some bookshops, particularly Paper Plus, I think it's selling.
Paper Plus, yeah, but Te Whakaruruhau have it, but there's also copies here.
Yeah, we've got some copies for
I'm
sale.
not from here.
Right,
So,
okay.
and I did a thing recently, I went to search over in Feilding to get things on, in Humberston North to get things on homelessness. And found two things, neither of which were in the library.
Right. Well, this hasn't been published yet.
Yeah, I understand.
And when it is, we're actually uncertain at the moment. We really don't know where it will be available, but it will be available in libraries, I'm sure. Yeah, we can.
The book tells the whole history of the project, doesn't
Yes,
it?
it does.
Starts right from the beginning.
Yes.
I review books that are about New Zealand history. I'd love to review this book. So.
Right.
Excellent. Well, again, it's not a linear. Well, it is sort of linear.
This one is a bit more linear.
It's got
So many
people
things
all
aren't
around
linear,
it. You know, it's stories being told along the line,
Right,
and I think that's the way that works.
Yeah. And one of the things Venetia and I did as part of it, we went out. The team had they ran a connections week where they went out on the streets at about 5 o'clock in the morning for a week, and they just went looking for people and to see who was still out there, what help they might want. They talked to people sleeping in the streets and also people in cars, and who was sleeping in cars. And Venetia and I got up every morning at 4 o'clock, and we got down there at 5 and went out with them, and that was big stuff for us. We saw and we talked to people, and one of the people, I was with a team that were down in Frankton and Hamilton, and we found a car at Dinsdale Library, which is like this in the suburb of Hamilton, and Lisa, the case manager who I was with, she tapped on the window, and long story short, there was a man sleeping in his car who was 59 and he looked about 89 and he was very, very unwell. And we got him into the office and got him to a doctor and got some food into him. He'd had a job, he'd had a family, he'd worn his family out, he said, which a lot of people say that same thing. And he died 2 months later in hospital, but there was some comfort with People's Project that they'd found him. In that time, they'd managed to reconnect him with his family. He didn't die in a car on a cold night.
Yes.
He died with some dignity in hospital, and he's the prologue to our book because, and just for me, standing back and watching Lisa, the case manager, in action, she sat on the concrete, cold concrete, beside him in his car, and just talked to him. She was at the level where she could make eye contact with him, and she just said, "There's some things we can do to help you." She didn't come in like a full, and too strongly. It was amazing.
Luke, you asked the question about bringing stories forward and how you do that, and the story in this book, which I think we're both very proud of. Denise wrote a story about a long-term streetie who died the year before the book, or
Yes,
the year
it was
of the book?
the year
Yeah, but
the
anyway,
year before, I think.
Yeah. And
I had written that for the Waikato Times.
yeah, the Waikato Times at that stage was running obituaries. We'd run them for quite a few years, and they were always important people who had gongs and
Yeah.
you know
And
knighthoods
civic engineers and, you know.
And I think I suggested to Denise that maybe this man could be an obituary in the Waikato Times. I wasn't working there at the time, and Denise rang the editor, and he agreed.
Yeah.
And this
So
Sam, his obituary appeared with, you know, in the space usually reserved for all those important, just about
That's
his
a good
life.
nice to know them.
And it was just, I just about wept. It was just an amazing sort of
But he
affirmation.
was a Hamilton character. He'd been around the CBD busking and begging, and you know everyone knew Sam, and so it was Venetia's. I mean, idea, and
No, it was just lovely. I mean, I was glad that Jonathan agreed to it, and he will appear in the book. There's the last section, a truncated version of his obituary. So yeah.
There we go, more teamwork.
Sue, you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you are using the same photographer for this last.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, because you know there's the old cliche that every picture tells a thousand words, and you know the first one was amazing.
They're beautiful, aren't they? Yeah, there's some fabulous
I'll
photos.
pass it on to
It's
Peter.
really-
Thank you.
But he was the chief photographer at the Waikato Times when all the years that we worked there, and we're very fond of him.
So he gave of his time and money for nothing, but like,
He does it at a very reduced
Yeah,
rate.
yeah, he
It's
does.
incredibly reduced because he's working now mostly in commercial sort of areas. So you know, it's a nice man to work with, and he, like all photographers, very professional about how he goes about it. Yeah. Well, we might wind up
Yes,
I think
here.
so.
I think
Thank
you've been
you.
such a
Yeah,
good
you
audience.
have.
Thank you so much for your
It's
questions.
been really lovely to be
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you both.
I don't know about you, but my heart feels like it's split in tatters at the moment, hearing those stories. And yeah, so thank you for your complete dissected writing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so
That's really lovely. Thank you.
it's just a small
Thank
thing.
you. That's just lovely. Thank
Absolutely love
you.
those gifts.
Yeah, we really do.
We should take it back with us to look
Yeah.
after it.
And,
Don't let the toys eat all
yeah.
the buds.
It's going to be a long time.
My husband, Bill, died a couple of years ago, and the kowhai was probably his favourite tree. So, and we do
That's
have some
lovely.
at our place, but I'll have a new one now. So that's lovely. Thank you.
Okay, enjoy the rest of your
Ready?
Thank you.
Coming back tomorrow.
Yes, I'm here Sunday, Monday, right the way through.